"Shut up, illiterate!" The teacher screamed at the quiet boy who barely spoke English in her Phoenix classroom. Mrs. Williams had spent months dismissing Miguel Rodriguez as functionally illiterate, convinced his accented speech and humble appearance meant he lacked basic academic skills. When she assigned a simple vacation essay, she expected his usual struggling sentences that confirmed her prejudiced assumptions about the immigrant child. Instead, Miguel quietly placed 7 versions of the same sophisticated essay on her desk, written in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Italian, and Mandarin Chinese, revealing multilingual genius that shattered everything she thought she knew about intelligence. Miguel Rodriguez sat quietly in the back corner of his 5th-grade classroom at Lincoln Elementary School in downtown Phoenix, his worn notebook and second-hand pencil reflecting the economic struggles that his single mother Elena faced while working double shifts at 2 different restaurants to support their small family. "Today we're going to write about our summer vacation," announced Mrs. Patricia Williams, the veteran teacher whose 23 years of experience had made her confident in her ability to assess student capabilities based on first impressions and superficial characteristics that often correlated with academic performance. "I want everyone to write at least 2 paragraphs about something interesting you did during your time off from school," she continued, her instructions delivered with the authoritative tone that characterized educators who had grown comfortable with their classroom dominance and rarely encountered challenges to their professional judgment. Miguel raised his small hand tentatively, his movement barely noticeable among the more aggressive attention-seeking behaviors of classmates who had learned that academic success often required self-advocacy and confident participation in classroom discussions. "Yes, Miguel," Mrs. Williams acknowledged with barely concealed impatience, her tone suggesting that she expected his question to be simple or potentially disruptive to the lesson flow that she had carefully planned for maximum efficiency and minimal deviation from standard curriculum requirements. "Mrs. Williams, may I write about visiting my grandmother in Mexico?" Miguel asked politely, his accented English reflecting the bilingual household where Spanish served as the primary language of family communication while English remained the academic requirement that determined his success in American educational institutions. "Miguel, we've discussed this before," Mrs. Williams replied with exasperation that had been building throughout the semester as she encountered what she perceived as linguistic limitations that interfered with her teaching objectives. "You need to focus on improving your English writing skills instead of thinking about foreign languages that won't help you succeed in American schools." Her response reflected educational philosophies that prioritized linguistic assimilation over multilingual competency while dismissing cultural connections that could enhance rather than hinder academic achievement. "But Mrs. Williams, my trip was really interesting, and I learned about Aztec history and ancient civilizations that—" Miguel began to explain before being interrupted by his teacher's increasingly frustrated response. "Miguel Rodriguez, I don't have time for your excuses about why you can't write a simple assignment in proper English," Mrs. Williams snapped, her professional patience finally exhausted by what she perceived as another attempt by a struggling student to avoid academic responsibilities through cultural deflection and linguistic confusion. "You've been in my class for 3 months. And your English writing is still barely comprehensible, which suggests that you're not putting in sufficient effort to master the language skills that will determine your future academic and professional success." Her harsh assessment ignored the complexity of second language acquisition while attributing Miguel's measured classroom participation to laziness rather than the cultural adjustment and linguistic development that characterized immigrant children navigating between home and school environments. "Every time I give a writing assignment, you find some excuse about your family or your culture instead of focusing on the basic English skills that you desperately need to develop if you want to pass 5th grade and continue your education." Her criticism reflected educational approaches that viewed cultural background as obstacle to overcome rather than resource to leverage in developing comprehensive language abilities that could enhance academic performance. "Mrs. Williams, I can write in English," Miguel replied quietly, his calm tone contrasting sharply with his teacher's aggressive frustration while demonstrating the respectful demeanor that his mother had taught him to maintain even when facing unfair treatment from authority figures. I just thought it would be interesting to share what I learned about different cultures and historical connections between Mexico and the United States. His explanation attempted to bridge cultural education with academic requirements while suggesting deeper knowledge than his teacher had recognized or appreciated during their previous classroom interactions. "Don't give me that nonsense about historical connections," Mrs. Williams retorted. "You can barely write a complete sentence in English, and now you're trying to convince me that you understand complex historical concepts that require advanced language skills and analytical thinking." Her dismissive response revealed assumptions about cognitive ability based on linguistic performance while ignoring the possibility that intelligence could manifest in languages other than English or through cultural knowledge that transcended traditional academic categories. "Miguel, I'm going to be very clear with you," she continued with the condescending tone that characterized teachers who had lost patience with students they deemed incapable of meeting academic expectations. "You are functionally illiterate in English, and until you master basic writing skills, you have no business discussing advanced topics like history or cultural connections." Her brutal assessment would soon prove to be one of the most embarrassing professional misjudgments of her educational career. The moment that would transform Mrs. Williams' perception of her students' capabilities began when Miguel quietly opened his notebook and began writing with the focused concentration that characterized someone accessing knowledge and skills that had been dismissed or overlooked by educators who equated linguistic accent with cognitive limitation. "I'll show you what I learned during my summer vacation," Miguel whispered to himself as he began crafting an essay that would challenge every assumption his teacher had made about his intellectual capacity and academic potential. "My summer journey through time. Discovering ancient civilizations in modern Mexico," he wrote as his title, the sophisticated phrasing immediately suggesting language abilities that exceeded his teacher's assessment of his English proficiency and academic readiness. His introduction paragraph flowed with grammatical precision and vocabulary sophistication that contradicted months of classroom observations about his supposed linguistic limitations and intellectual inadequacy. "During my summer vacation, I had the extraordinary opportunity to visit my grandmother Rosa in Puebla, Mexico, where I discovered that learning about the past can illuminate understanding of the present while creating bridges between different cultures that share more similarities than differences," Miguel wrote, his complex sentence structure demonstrating mastery of English composition that surpassed many of his native-speaking classmates. Mrs. Williams glanced over at Miguel's desk with curiosity about what kind of simplistic sentences he might be producing, her expectation of barely coherent writing soon to be shattered by evidence that would force her to confront the prejudiced assumptions that had informed her teaching approach throughout the semester. "What I learned during those 3 weeks changed my understanding of history, language, and the connections between ancient civilizations and modern communities that continue to honor traditions while adapting to contemporary challenges," Miguel continued, his academic vocabulary and analytical thinking exceeding anything Mrs. Williams had imagined possible from someone she had labeled as functionally illiterate. The confidence and fluency that characterized his writing stood in stark contrast to his quiet classroom demeanor, suggesting that linguistic competence and intellectual capacity could exist independently of classroom participation patterns that teachers often use to assess student ability and potential. The continuation of Miguel's essay revealed knowledge and analytical capabilities that demonstrated extensive learning beyond anything that occurred in Mrs. Williams' classroom, forcing observers to question whether her assessment methods adequately identified student strengths and intellectual resources. "My grandmother Rosa is not only a repository of family history but also a scholar who speaks Nahuatl, Spanish, English, and Portuguese, having spent her youth traveling throughout Latin America as a linguistic researcher before returning to Mexico to preserve indigenous languages that are disappearing due to cultural assimilation and modernization pressures," Miguel wrote, his biographical description of his grandmother revealing family intellectual traditions that his teacher had never suspected or inquired about during their academic interactions. The sophisticated vocabulary and complex sentence structures that characterized his writing demonstrated English language mastery that exceeded grade-level expectations while incorporating cultural knowledge that enriched rather than hindered his academic expression. "During my visit, Abuela Rosa taught me about the mathematical achievements of ancient Aztec civilization, including their sophisticated calendar system and astronomical observations that rival those of any ancient civilization, while also showing me how Nahuatl vocabulary has influenced both Spanish and English in ways that most people never recognize, Miguel continued. His interdisciplinary knowledge spanning mathematics, astronomy, linguistics, and cultural history in ways that demonstrated intellectual curiosity and learning capacity that formal classroom assessments had failed to identify or measure. Mrs. Williams found herself reading over Miguel's shoulder with growing amazement as his essay revealed depths of knowledge and analytical thinking that contradicted every assumption she had made about his cognitive abilities and academic potential. The architectural principles that governed Tenochtitlan's construction demonstrate engineering sophistication that European cities wouldn't achieve for centuries, and understanding these achievements requires recognizing that intelligence and innovation have always existed across all cultures, regardless of whether Western educational systems acknowledge or value such contributions, Miguel wrote. His critical analysis of educational bias demonstrating metacognitive awareness that surpassed anything Mrs. Williams expected from elementary students while implicitly challenging her own cultural assumptions and teaching methods. The philosophical sophistication of his observations suggested intellectual maturity that extended far beyond simple assignment completion to encompass critical thinking about systemic issues that affected his own educational experience. The climactic moment of Mrs. Williams' humiliation arrived when Miguel quietly approached her desk and placed his completed essay in front of her, along with 6 additional versions of the same essay written in different languages that demonstrated multilingual capabilities she had never imagined possible from someone she had dismissed as functionally illiterate. Mrs. Williams, here's my essay about my summer vacation, Miguel said respectfully, his polite demeanor unchanged despite the devastating evidence he was about to present regarding her professional competence and assessment accuracy. I wrote it in English as you requested, but I also wrote it in Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Italian, and Mandarin Chinese, because my grandmother taught me that true education means being able to communicate across cultures and languages. His explanation was delivered without arrogance or vindictiveness, though the implicit criticism of her monolingual limitations and cultural prejudices was unmistakable to anyone observing the interaction. Mrs. Williams stared at the 7 versions of Miguel's essay with growing horror as she realized the magnitude of her misjudgment and the professional embarrassment that would follow when other educators discovered that she had labeled a polyglot child as functionally illiterate based on his accented English and quiet classroom demeanor. "Miguel, where did these come from?" she asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper as she processed the reality that her most dismissed student possessed academic capabilities that exceeded her own linguistic achievements and cultural knowledge. "Did someone help you write these?" Her desperate hope that the essays were somehow fraudulent reflected her inability to accept that her professional judgment had been so catastrophically wrong about a student's intellectual capacity and educational potential. "No, Mrs. Williams, I wrote them all myself," Miguel replied calmly. "My grandmother has been teaching me languages since I was very young, and I practice writing in different languages to improve my skills and understanding of how ideas can be expressed through various linguistic and cultural frameworks." His explanation revealed systematic multilingual education that had been occurring outside of formal schooling while highlighting the narrow scope of Mrs. Williams' assessment methods that had failed to identify or value such extraordinary achievements. "Would you like me to read any of them aloud to demonstrate my pronunciation and comprehension?" Miguel offered politely, his question creating additional pressure for Mrs. Williams, who realized that her ignorance of other languages would prevent her from evaluating the quality of his work in most of the linguistic systems he claimed to have mastered. The German version discusses how Aztec mathematical concepts influenced European Renaissance thinking through Spanish colonial connections, while the Mandarin version explores similarities between ancient Chinese and Mesoamerican astronomical observations that suggest universal human capacity for scientific achievement, Miguel explained, his sophisticated analysis demonstrating not just multilingual ability but also comparative cultural knowledge that revealed extensive learning beyond Anything available in elementary school curricula. The stunned silence that filled the classroom as other students observed Miguel's multilingual demonstration created an atmosphere of amazement and confusion as 11-year-olds struggled to process the revelation that their quiet classmate possessed academic capabilities that none of them had suspected during months of shared educational experiences. "Miguel, can you really write in all those languages?" asked Jessica Martinez, her voice reflecting the wonder that characterized children discovering that their assumptions about peer capabilities might be completely incorrect. "I can barely write a good paragraph in English, and you wrote the same story in 7 different languages?" Her question articulated the amazement that other students felt while highlighting the extraordinary nature of Miguel's multilingual achievements compared to typical elementary school language abilities. "Yes, I can write and speak in all of them," Miguel replied modestly. "My grandmother taught me that learning languages opens doors to understanding different cultures and ways of thinking about the world, which makes you a better person and a better student." His explanation emphasized educational value over personal achievement while providing insight into family values that prioritized multilingual competency as foundation for intellectual and cultural development. "That's incredible," exclaimed David Thompson, normally one of the more academically confident students who had never imagined that quiet Miguel possessed abilities that exceeded his own English-only capabilities. "You're like a walking United Nations or something. You could be a translator or diplomat when you grow up." His enthusiasm reflected genuine admiration while suggesting career possibilities that Miguel's multilingual skills could enable in ways that monolingual students couldn't easily achieve. "Mrs. Williams, why did you say Miguel couldn't write in English when he obviously can?" asked Sarah Chen with the direct questioning that characterized children who noticed inconsistencies between teacher statements and observable evidence. "His English essay is better than most of ours, and he wrote 6 other versions in languages that none of us even know." Her observation created additional pressure for Mrs. Williams, who realized that her students had witnessed her professional misjudgment and would remember this incident as example of teacher fallibility and bias. "Yeah, Mrs. Williams," added Marcus Washington. "You always tell us that we should never judge people without knowing them, but you judged Miguel without knowing that he was probably the smartest kid in our class." His application of classroom moral lessons to teacher behavior demonstrated how children could recognize hypocrisy and apply ethical standards to authority figures who had failed to live up to their own stated principles. The student observations created a teaching moment that reversed normal classroom dynamics by exposing how prejudice and assumption could lead educators to misjudge student capabilities while missing opportunities to recognize and nurture exceptional talents that existed outside traditional assessment frameworks. The administrative consequences of Miguel's multilingual revelation began to unfold when Principal Dorothy Henderson, attracted by the unusual classroom commotion, entered the room to investigate the disruption and discovered a situation that would require careful handling to protect both student and teacher while addressing obvious assessment failures that had characterized Miguel's educational experience. "Mrs. Williams, what's happening here?" Principal Henderson inquired as she observed the multilingual essays spread across the teacher's desk while noting the mixture of excitement and confusion that characterized student reactions to Miguel's demonstrated capabilities. "I heard voices from the hallway, and I wanted to make sure everything was proceeding smoothly." Her diplomatic inquiry masked growing concern about the situation's implications for educational assessment and teacher competency while seeking to understand how such extraordinary student capabilities had remained unrecognized for months. "Principal Henderson, Miguel has just demonstrated writing abilities in 7 languages that I was unaware of previously," Mrs. Williams replied carefully, her diplomatic phrasing attempting to minimize the professional embarrassment of having labeled a polyglot student as functionally illiterate while avoiding direct admission of discriminatory assumptions that had informed her assessment methods. "I see," Henderson responded thoughtfully as she examined Miguel's essays with growing appreciation for both the student's achievements and the complexity of the situation that would require administrative intervention. "Miguel, these essays are quite impressive. Where did you develop such extensive multilingual capabilities?" Her question directed attention toward Miguel's positive achievements while gathering information that could inform more appropriate educational programming for a student whose abilities had been seriously underestimated by current classroom placement. "My grandmother Rosa taught me, Principal Henderson," Miguel explained with the same respectful demeanor that had characterized his interactions throughout the incident. "She believes that learning multiple languages helps you understand different cultures and become a better citizen of the world." His explanation provided context for his multilingual achievements while emphasizing family values that prioritized education and cultural competency over material acquisition or social status. "Miguel, would you be willing to meet with our gifted education coordinator to discuss educational opportunities that might better match your demonstrated abilities?" Henderson asked, her question acknowledging that current classroom placement might not provide appropriate challenge or recognition for someone with such exceptional linguistic and analytical capabilities. "Yes, Principal Henderson, I would like that very much," Miguel replied with enthusiasm that suggested he had been hoping for educational experiences that matched his intellectual capacity and multilingual interests. "I want to keep learning and maybe help other students who speak different languages feel more comfortable in school." His expression of interest in peer mentoring demonstrated maturity and social consciousness that exceeded typical elementary student concerns while suggesting leadership potential that had been overlooked due to his quiet classroom demeanor and cultural background. The professional development implications of Miguel's case became apparent when Principal Henderson realized that Mrs. Williams' assessment failures reflected broader systemic issues about cultural bias and linguistic prejudice that required institutional intervention beyond individual teacher correction or student reclassification. "Mrs. Williams, I think we need to schedule a meeting to discuss assessment methods and cultural sensitivity in student evaluation," Henderson said diplomatically. Her suggestion masking serious concerns about discriminatory practices that had prevented recognition of exceptional student capabilities while potentially violating educational equity principles. "Because this situation suggests that our current approaches might not effectively identify diverse forms of student achievement and potential." Her careful phrasing avoided direct criticism while establishing need for systematic review of teaching practices that had led to such spectacular misjudgment of student ability. "I agree completely," Mrs. Williams replied with obvious relief that her principal was framing the incident as learning opportunity rather than disciplinary matter, though she understood that her professional reputation had been damaged by public demonstration of bias and incompetence. "I clearly made assumptions that were unfair to Miguel and prevented me from recognizing his exceptional abilities." Her acknowledgement of error represented progress toward understanding how prejudice could affect professional judgment, though Principal Henderson wondered whether such recognition would translate into meaningful changes in teaching practice and student assessment methods. "Miguel, I want you to know that your achievements are remarkable and that we're going to work together to ensure that your educational experience matches your capabilities and interests," Henderson assured the student. "And I hope this incident helps everyone understand that students bring diverse strengths and knowledge to school that may not be immediately apparent through traditional assessment methods." Her statement to Miguel provided validation while establishing educational principles that could guide future teacher training and student evaluation practices. "Thank you, Principal Henderson," Miguel replied gratefully. "I just want to learn and help other students feel welcome in school, especially those who speak languages other than English or come from different cultural backgrounds." His expression of inclusive values demonstrated character that exceeded his academic achievements while suggesting leadership potential that appropriate educational programming could develop and channel toward positive social impact. "Mrs. Williams, I'd like you to think about how we can use this experience to improve our teaching practices and ensure that all students receive appropriate recognition and educational opportunities regardless of their cultural background or language of origin," Henderson concluded. Her diplomatic directive establishing expectation for professional growth while avoiding public humiliation that could damage teacher effectiveness or school climate. The revelation of Miguel's extraordinary capabilities prompted immediate review of his educational placement and programming, with Principal Henderson convening meetings with gifted education specialists, English as second language coordinators, and cultural diversity advocates to develop appropriate academic challenges that matched his demonstrated abilities. Miguel's case highlights significant gaps in our identification procedures for culturally and linguistically diverse gifted students, noted Dr. Patricia Santos, the district's gifted education coordinator, during an emergency assessment meeting, because traditional screening methods often fail to recognize exceptional abilities when they're expressed through non-mainstream cultural or linguistic frameworks. Her professional analysis provided context for understanding how Miguel's talents had remained hidden while emphasizing need for systematic changes in identification and assessment procedures that could prevent similar oversights. The multilingual essays demonstrate not just language proficiency but sophisticated analytical thinking and cultural knowledge that exceed grade-level expectations by several years, observed ESL specialist Robert Chen as he reviewed Miguel's work. And his ability to express complex historical and philosophical concepts across multiple linguistic systems suggests cognitive abilities that require immediate educational intervention and appropriate challenge. His assessment highlighted the urgency of providing advanced programming that could nurture Miguel's exceptional capabilities while preventing the academic stagnation that resulted from inappropriate classroom placement. We need to develop individualized education programming that leverages his multilingual strengths while providing advanced content in areas where he demonstrates exceptional capability, recommended school psychologist Dr. Maria Rodriguez, because students with his profile require specialized educational approaches that honor their cultural assets while challenging their intellectual development. Her prescription for individualized programming acknowledged that Miguel's needs transcended typical gifted education services to require culturally responsive approaches that built on rather than replaced his multilingual competencies. I'm also concerned about the social and emotional impact of having his abilities dismissed and his intelligence questioned for months, added Counselor Jennifer Walsh, because students who experience such systematic underestimation often develop academic anxiety and reduced motivation that can affect their long-term educational outcomes. Her observation about psychological consequences highlighted how Mrs. Williams' misjudgment had created potential trauma that would require therapeutic intervention alongside educational remediation. Miguel's case will become a teaching tool for our entire district, Principal Henderson concluded, because it perfectly illustrates how cultural bias and linguistic prejudice can prevent educators from recognizing and nurturing exceptional student capabilities that could benefit not just individual learners but entire school communities through peer mentoring and cultural bridge building. Her commitment to systematic learning from Miguel's experience suggested institutional growth that could improve educational outcomes for other culturally and linguistically diverse students who possessed unrecognized talents and capabilities. The media attention that Miguel's story attracted when shared by proud family members on social media created broader conversations about educational equity, cultural bias, and the need for teacher training that prepared educators to recognize and value diverse forms of student achievement and intellectual expression. This fifth grader's multilingual essays demonstrate capabilities that most adults never achieve, reported education journalist David Kim during a television segment about Miguel's case. Yet his teacher labeled him as functionally illiterate based on assumptions about accent and cultural background that reveal systematic problems in how we prepare educators to work with diverse student populations. His analysis connected Miguel's individual experience to broader educational issues while highlighting the need for systematic reform in teacher preparation and professional development programs. The fact that Miguel's extraordinary capabilities remained hidden for months suggests that our schools are failing to identify and nurture talents that exist in culturally and linguistically diverse communities, noted education policy expert Dr. Patricia Williams during a panel discussion about educational equity. And this case should prompt serious examination of assessment methods and cultural competency requirements for educators at all levels. Her commentary emphasized institutional responsibility for creating conditions that allowed such spectacular misjudgment while advocating for systematic changes that could prevent similar failures. Miguel's story resonates with many immigrant families whose children's capabilities are underestimated or dismissed by educators who equate accent or cultural background with cognitive limitation, observed cultural diversity advocate Maria Santos. and it highlights the need for educational approaches that view multilingualism as asset rather than deficit in academic achievement and intellectual development. Her perspective provided voice for communities that had experienced similar educational bias while advocating for pedagogical approaches that leveraged rather than suppressed cultural and linguistic diversity. The most inspiring aspect of this story, concluded community leader Robert Martinez, is how Miguel maintained respect and dignity despite facing systematic prejudice, and how his grandmother's investment in multilingual education created capabilities that will serve him throughout his life regardless of whether formal education recognizes their value. His observation about family resilience and educational investment provided counter-narrative to deficit-based assumptions about immigrant communities while celebrating cultural values that prioritized learning and intellectual development over material advancement. This case should transform how we think about student assessment and teacher preparation, Principal Henderson told reporters, because Miguel's achievements demonstrate that exceptional capabilities exist in every community, and our responsibility as educators is to recognize and nurture those talents regardless of how they're expressed culturally or linguistically. Her institutional commitment to change suggested that Miguel's experience could catalyze broader educational improvements that would benefit future generations of diverse students whose talents might otherwise remain unrecognized. The deeper investigation into Miguel's educational background revealed that his grandmother Rosa Rodriguez possessed a doctoral degree in comparative linguistics from the University of Mexico City and had spent decades developing educational methodologies that integrated traditional indigenous knowledge with modern pedagogical approaches to create comprehensive learning experiences for multilingual children. Rosa has been working with Miguel since he was 3 years old, explained Elena Rodriguez during a parent conference that had been arranged to better understand her son's extraordinary capabilities, teaching him that languages are tools for understanding different ways of thinking about the world, and that education should connect rather than separate cultural knowledge and academic achievement. Her description of family educational values provided context for Miguel's achievements while highlighting generational commitment to learning that transcended formal schooling. My mother believes that children learn best when their cultural knowledge is valued and integrated with academic content, Elena continued. So she's been teaching Miguel about mathematics through Aztec number systems, about astronomy through indigenous calendar observations, and about literature through traditional stories that connect to modern themes and universal human experiences. Her explanation of integrated learning approaches demonstrated sophisticated educational philosophy that had produced results exceeding anything achieved through traditional classroom instruction alone. Rosa speaks 9 languages herself, Elena revealed, and she's published research about how multilingual education enhances cognitive development and analytical thinking in ways that monolingual approaches cannot achieve. But most American schools don't recognize or value such research because it challenges conventional assumptions about language learning and cultural assimilation. Her academic credentials provided authority for the educational methods that had produced Miguel's exceptional capabilities while highlighting institutional resistance to pedagogical innovation that originated outside mainstream educational establishments. When Miguel started school, Rosa warned me that teachers might not understand his capabilities because they're trained to see multilingualism as problem to overcome rather than resource to leverage, Elena explained. But I hope that educators would recognize his abilities and adapt their teaching methods to challenge and nurture his intellectual development. Her disappointment with Mrs. Williams' response reflected broader frustrations experienced by immigrant families whose children's capabilities were systematically underestimated by educational institutions that lacked cultural competency and multilingual appreciation. Rosa wants to volunteer in schools to help teachers understand how to work effectively with multilingual students, Elena offered, because she believes that education improves when teachers learn from families and communities rather than assuming that professional training provides all necessary knowledge about student capabilities and cultural assets. Her proposal for community school partnership reflected understanding that educational improvement required collaboration between formal institutions and cultural communities that possessed complementary knowledge and resources. Miguel's success demonstrates that family investment in education can produce remarkable results, Elena concluded. But it also shows that schools need to change their approaches to recognize and build on the strengths that diverse students bring rather than trying to replace cultural knowledge with mainstream academic content. Her analysis of educational reform needs provided framework for understanding how Miguel's case could catalyze systematic improvements in culturally responsive teaching practices and multilingual student support services. The professional development workshop that Principal Henderson organized for district teachers used Miguel's case as centerpiece for training about cultural bias, linguistic prejudice, and methods for recognizing diverse forms of student achievement that might not be evident through traditional assessment approaches. Miguel's story illustrates how assumptions about accent, cultural background, and classroom participation can lead to spectacular misjudgments about student capability and potential, explained diversity training consultant Dr. Jennifer Walsh as she addressed 50 educators who had volunteered for cultural competency professional development. And it demonstrates the need for assessment methods that look beyond surface characteristics to identify actual knowledge, skills, and intellectual capacity. Her presentation used Miguel's multilingual essays as concrete evidence of capabilities that had been overlooked due to prejudiced assumptions while providing framework for understanding how bias affected professional judgment in classroom settings. The fact that Miguel wrote sophisticated analytical essays in 7 languages while his teacher considered him functionally illiterate reveals systematic problems in how we prepare educators to work with culturally and linguistically diverse student populations, Dr. Walsh continued. And it highlights the need for assessment approaches that value rather than penalize multilingual competencies and cultural knowledge that enhance rather than hinder academic achievement. Her analysis connected individual teaching failures to broader institutional issues while advocating for systematic changes in educator preparation and ongoing professional development requirements. Many of you are probably wondering how you might miss similar capabilities in your own students, Dr. Walsh observed. And the answer is that traditional assessment methods often fail to identify strengths that are expressed through non-mainstream cultural or linguistic frameworks, especially when students are quiet, respectful, or come from families that prioritize collective over individual achievement. Her explanation of cultural differences in academic expression provided practical guidance for recognizing diverse learning styles and communication patterns that might mask exceptional abilities. Miguel's case also demonstrates how family educational investment can produce results that exceed anything achieved through formal schooling alone, Dr. Walsh noted, which suggests that effective teaching requires partnership with families and communities rather than replacement of cultural knowledge with mainstream academic content. Her emphasis on collaborative approaches challenged traditional assumptions about professional authority while encouraging educators to view cultural diversity as resource rather than obstacle to academic achievement. The most important lesson from Miguel's story, Dr. Walsh concluded, is that exceptional capabilities exist in every community and cultural group, and our responsibility as educators is to recognize, value, and nurture those talents regardless of how they're expressed or what languages they use for intellectual development. Her call for inclusive education provided philosophical foundation for teaching practices that could prevent future incidents while creating conditions that allowed all students to demonstrate their full potential. The systemic changes that Miguel's case catalyzed throughout the school district included revision of assessment procedures, enhancement of cultural competency training requirements, and development of multilingual student identification protocols that could prevent similar oversights while recognizing diverse forms of academic achievement and intellectual expression. We're implementing mandatory bias training for all instructional personnel, announced Superintendent Robert Chen during a district-wide meeting, because Miguel's experience demonstrates how unconscious prejudice can prevent educators from recognizing and nurturing exceptional student capabilities that exist across all cultural and linguistic communities. His commitment to comprehensive professional development reflected recognition that individual incidents often revealed systematic problems that required institutional intervention rather than just personal correction or remediation. Additionally, we're establishing multilingual assessment teams that include community members who can evaluate student capabilities in languages other than English, Chen continued. because traditional monolingual assessment approaches clearly fail to identify talents and knowledge that are expressed through diverse linguistic and cultural frameworks. His description of expanded assessment capabilities acknowledged that effective evaluation required cultural and linguistic expertise that most educators lacked despite their professional training and classroom experience. We're also creating family liaison positions that will help teachers understand the educational assets and cultural knowledge that students bring from their home communities, Chen added. Because effective teaching requires understanding of student backgrounds rather than assumptions based on superficial characteristics or stereotypical expectations about particular cultural groups. His emphasis on community partnership reflected understanding that educational improvement required collaboration between schools and families rather than replacement of cultural knowledge with mainstream academic content. Miguel's case will be used in our teacher preparation programs as example of how bias and assumption can prevent recognition of exceptional student capabilities, Chen concluded. And it will remind future educators that their primary responsibility is to identify and nurture talents that exist in every classroom regardless of how those talents are expressed culturally or linguistically. His commitment to systematic learning from Miguel's experience suggested institutional growth that could improve educational outcomes for diverse student populations while preventing similar assessment failures. The goal is to create educational environments where every student's capabilities are recognized, valued, and developed to their full potential, Chen emphasized, because that's not just good educational practice. It's the foundation of equitable schooling that serves all communities effectively. His vision of inclusive education provided framework for reforms that could transform district culture while ensuring that future Miguel Rodriguez students would receive appropriate recognition and programming from their first day in school.